So we're in a series of talks on living Buddhism. It's how to practice today in the 21st century here in Sheffield. And the things we've been exploring are very much guided by the founder of Triratna, Sangha. And what he did is he took a radical approach to the Dharma. And that's using radical in its original sense, which is going back to the roots. So he went back to the roots of the teachings of the Buddha, the Dharma, and kind of went under the cultural surface appearance of Buddhism. So in different countries, Buddhism looks very different. People wear different clothes, they do different rituals, they perhaps focus on different parts of the Dharma. And what he did was look underneath that and see what's the really important, what is the Dharma that we need to know. And today I'm looking at an aspect of that, which is about reimagining enlightenment. So this is about how can our capacity that we have as human beings for imagination help us to move towards enlightenment? And how might that be different for us in this culture than for people from different cultures, different times and places? And imagination in the dictionary is the faculty or action of forming new ideas or images or concepts of external objects not present to the senses, or the ability of the mind to be creative or resourceful. And when I'm talking about imagining today, sometimes it sounds very visual. And in fact, I'm going to show some pictures. And there's a picture here, and there's lots of visual imagery around. Today, there is a lot of visual imagery. But actually, imagination is much more than visual. Visual might be part of it. But for some people, sounds like mantra can really help people connect to imagine, to connect with imagination, to form images or concepts of something. Often it's a felt sense. So for me, that's usually when I'm imagining, it's often a felt sense. It's a bit like, say, I bring to mind the Buddha. I don't see him that clearly, but I have a sense that if I have my eyes closed, that he's there. And if I open my eyes, I'd see him. So it's a felt sense of him being in the room. And that's quite an emotional response, actually. I think I have an emotional response of what would it be like to actually be in the same room as the Buddha. Or it might be deep intuition. Sometimes our imagination can actually take quite an intuitive kind of response. So we feel something, we experience something. And it's not pictures, but it's our imagination still. So please, as every time all these pictures come up, just remember there are lots of other ways of imagining. So I thought we'd start by doing a little bit of imagining and seeing whatever way we do it. So I wondered if you'd be happy to just get yourself comfortable, kind of in a meditation kind of posture, but still sitting on the chairs if you're sitting on the chairs. So I'm going to just say a few different things and just see what your response to that is imaginatively. And like I've just said, it might be visual and you see images. You maybe hear sounds. Some people might smell smells, whatever sense you might do that. Or you might just feel it, or a mixture of those, or have some kind of an emotional response. Okay, so the first one is imagine you find yourself suddenly, you're in the middle of Tokyo in the rush hour. There are loads of crowds and crowds of people crossing the road. There's huge neon advertising signs, lots of traffic, lots of noise. There's lots of energy. Okay, so now you move and you find yourself a lion. You're a lion or a lioness, and you're rolling in the sun on the savannah. You can feel the sun on you. You can hear the sounds of other animals, and you have a sense of your own strength, your own muscles, your own power. But you're very relaxed, just really enjoying being in a lion's body in the sun. So now you're at the bottom of the sea. The sounds are very muted, but there are some little sounds, watery sounds. The colours are very beautiful. There's many schools of tropical fish going by. And you can just move in the water as you like. You have the freedom. You don't need to worry about breathing. You're just swimming in the water, seeing the fish go by. There's an octopus. Just really enjoying being under the water. Now you're on another planet. completely other planet from this one, millions and billions of miles away in another galaxy, and you're sitting on this planet, and it's got 2 moons. And those 2 moons are really big in the sky, and you're really taking them in. And you can hear the sound of different kind of birds, different kind of animals. Maybe the gravity feels different. Your body weight feels different on this different planet. Now you're in a green forest, like a jungle, very beautiful, many flowers, many richness, lots of different kinds of plants and trees. You're enjoying the feeling on your skin of the light through the trees. You're walking through this forest on a path. And you can hear some laughter, which sounds really kind, actually, kind laughter in the distance. And you can hear some people talking. So you come to a clearing in the forest, and you see many monks and nuns sitting there, wearing robes, wearing traditional orange robes. And there's many people as well, not wearing robes, just wearing ordinary clothes, just sitting there. And they're listening and looking at a man in a patched robe, a middle-aged man, and he's talking. So as you walk into the clearing, he looks up and he looks at you. And you realize he must be the Buddha. There's something very special about him. And when he sees it's you, he smiles at you. He's really pleased to see that you've come to join him. And he invites you to come right down to the front and to sit beside him, really close to him. So you sit down in that clearing, in the jungle, right next to the Buddha. And you bathe in the atmosphere. You bathe in the Buddha's kindness. You have a real sense of someone who's just gone beyond pettiness and self-obsession, who's just full of peace and joy, who's radiating love. But also someone who's very powerful, full of energy, something very mysterious and profound, and perhaps even challenging. So you just sit and enjoy that experience. And just noticing for you how imagination works for you, if you connect with it, which of your senses is most alive. Okay, so open your eyes now, come back into Sheffield Buddhist Centre in 2023. And, well, I don't know what experience you had, but for me, I find it quite extraordinarily amazing that our minds can do this. We can just travel to the outer galaxies in our imagination. We can travel wherever. We can be with the Buddha nearly 2,600 years ago, and our imagination can do that for us. And apparently there's a quote, which I haven't got here actually, from Harry Potter, which is something like, I don't know if there's any Harry Potter fans who are going to get it. Anyway, there's something like, just because it's in your mind, only in your mind, Harry, doesn't mean it isn't true. Yeah, okay. So just because it's only in your mind doesn't mean it isn't true. So I guess if you were around at the time of the Buddha, if you met him, for many people, though not all actually, for many people they could feel something different about the Buddha. And many people actually became enlightened just by hearing a few words from the Buddha, just by being in his presence and spending time with him. So there's something about the actual being with an enlightened being that had a massive effect on people. But of course, many people at the time of the Buddha couldn't be with him all the time. They couldn't do that. So the Buddha himself suggested to people that if they couldn't be with him, they bring him and his qualities to mind. So they use their imagination. When they weren't with the Buddha, they could use their imagination. And there's a really beautiful verses that you might have heard, we often recite, from someone called Pingia. And Pingia was a really elderly man. He was starting to get quite old and infirm. And he did make it to see the Buddha, but then he needed to go back to his home. And somebody there said to him, why aren't you and he was really raving about the Buddha and the experience that he had. And someone said, well, why don't you spend all your time with the Buddha? And Pingia said, there is no moment for me, however small, that is spent away from Gautama. You see, sir, said Pingia, with constant and careful vigilance, it is possible for me to see him with my mind as clearly as with my eyes, in night as well as day. And since I spend my nights revering him, there is not, to my mind, a single moment spent away from him. I cannot now move away from the teaching of Gautama, that's the Buddha, Gautama. The powers of confidence and joy, of intellect and awareness hold me there. Whichever way this universe of wisdom goes, it draws me with it. Physically, I cannot move like that. My body is decaying, I'm old and weak, but the driving power of purposeful thought propels me with it without break. So there's a sense that Pingia, through his imagination, through bringing the Buddha to mind, found himself just able to think of him, be with him all the time. So it's nearly 2,600 years later now. So how do we connect with the Buddha, with this embodiment of enlightenment? How can we through our imagination? I think, first of all, for many people, it's not easy. For some people here, what I just did would not have worked particularly. I think many of us have our imagination squashed out of us at school, actually, or in our education. Someone I live with has just finished doing a fine art degree, and I've just been amazed to see how free it is. Like, she's doing the fine art degree, really free, really encouraged to have loads of ideas, lots of play. Whereas my education experience was not like that. It was really not like that. So it's a bit like imagination is perhaps not privileged, not particularly talked about in our society quite often. In fact, the opposite. For some of us, imagination has a sense of just making things up. It's not real, it's just made up. And hopefully we kind of explored during this talk that actually there's a difference between just fantasy and imagination. So fantasy is a kind of, we bring to mind things that we really crave and kind of build a fantasy around it. Imagination is where we open up to something bigger than us, something that has a sense of how we would like to be. I think, though, that many of us might say that we don't naturally have imagination. Actually, we probably have quite an excellent imagination. It's just we use it in some unhelpful ways. So many of us are really good at imagining dreadful things that might happen in the future and having a lot of anxiety that we give ourselves about things that never, ever happen. So we can really imagine the future and imagine these terrible things. Or we're really good at imagining having arguments with people and the amazing thing we'd say. And I find they just go round and round in my head, these conversations, these arguments with people. Or I can imagine times when I feel like people have insulted me or something like that. I've got a really good imagination for that. Or we might have a really strong imagination for craving, things like sexual desires, places we want to go to, the way we want our kitchen to look, whatever it is that, is your thing. Our imagination actually can be very strong. So the idea with using imagination in terms of moving towards enlightenment is that we are trying to refine our imagination. We're trying to use our imagination so that, that instead of it trapping us, actually it can transport us to higher dimensions. And this task of raising our imagination is an integral part of the task of raising our level of being. So we just gradually learn to focus our imagination on more refined, subtle, beautiful objects. So imagination, it can really help us to move towards a goal. So if we have an aim, whatever it means to us, it might be that we're thinking we want to become enlightened. We might be thinking we want to become kinder, wiser, more aware. We might be thinking we want to be less anxious, happier. Whatever it is that we want to be, what we can do is we can imagine that. We can have a sense of what that would be like. And by bringing that to mind, that will help us move towards there. And if what we want to do is wake up into reality and really understand the world to become enlightened, well, we can get imaginative glimpses of that, actually. And if we didn't have those glimpses, it would be really hard to be motivated. And as well as our imagination help us moving towards our goals, imagination can link us into something deeper. So this is myth. It can link us into our unconscious, the way that so much of us works. So myths, stories, images, archetypes that convey deep spiritual truths. And in a way, to live in full colour, we need to be living, we need myths that we're living from. Because if we don't choose our myths, they'll choose us. Okay, so it's a bit like, there's a sense in which, as human beings, living mythically is part of how we seem to have been evolved or designed. And if we don't choose myths we want, which might be to become enlightened, whatever it might be, we will find ourselves, other myths from our society will take us over. And they might be the myth that if you're really famous, really rich, really beautiful, you'll be really happy. For instance, that might be one that we find ourselves living by. I'm sure there are lots of others. I don't know, if you're really thin, if you're a woman, that is, if you're a really thin woman, then your life is just going to be amazing. That's a kind of myth of our society. Obviously completely ridiculous, but, one that we have. There's all sorts of, we might have a myth that we are separate from everybody else and we have to look after ourselves. We're completely independent. We mustn't rely on anybody else. In fact, we can just get by on our own. That is obviously a myth as well. So I'm just saying that we need to be choosing the myths that we live by. And what we can do is we can develop our imaginative potential. So what's great about the Dharma that the Buddha taught is that we can develop. If we want to choose to be a certain way, we can actually slowly move towards that. So we can develop, if we feel at the moment like we don't have much imagination, or we just use it for being anxious or something like that, what we can do is we can actually develop that. And there are various ways we can do that. So, of course, fiction, stories, that gives us a whole kind of imaginative way into other worlds. So novels, films, TV programs, theatre, games, and I don't know anything about it, kind of immersive 3D kind of stuff, all that kind of stuff where you're, what you do is you extend your boundaries and you experience being a different person. So in a great novel or something, you can experience coming from a different culture, you can experience being a different gender, living from a different class than you are, living in a different time. You can really start to see other people's and even animals' experience actually in fiction. And I guess what we need to be careful here, of course, is that whatever fiction whatever films we're watching or TV we're watching or whatever, books we're reading, well, what are we developing in ourselves? So if, I don't know. I remember there was a program on TV called Killing Eve that I watched that I really liked, actually. I thought it was very funny and witty. But I went on a long retreat and some of the violent images kept coming back to me in a way that really disturbed me, and they hadn't at the time. And in fact, what was really bad about it is actually they were humorous. So people were suffering and it was done as funny. And actually, something about watching that program did not develop the best side of me. Do you know what I mean? It was entertaining, but actually it left me with really disturbing images. And a lot of our culture, sadly, is like that. There's a fascination with violence, etc., etc. So there's something about what stories are we telling ourselves? And Sangha, who founded Triratna, he really encouraged people to explore, great art, whatever that means to you. And sometimes people get really upset because they feel like it's really elitist, that it might be, opera or whatever that we might go to. But I think there are great films, there are great novels we can read. There's things which really give us insight into other people, that really help us to have an imaginative connection with other people and animals. Which leads on to another thing that imagination does for us, which is empathy. So our imagination can really help us put ourselves in other people's shoes. And obviously doing the metta bhavana is very much a part of putting yourself, the neutral person, the person you don't like, trying as much as possible to imagine and empathize with what they experience. Because I'm sure we've all got experience if somebody does something, you think, why have they done that? And when you try and imagine yourself in their shoes, you realize, I can really understand it now. I can really see that. So, and also what that can allow us to do with imagination is just break out the prison of self. If we empathize, put ourselves in other people's shoes, we can start to break free of our own self-obsession. And something we can do is put ourselves in the shoes or whatever, in the experience of other people who are kinder and wiser, who are more advanced than us. What would that kind person do here? So if you find yourself in a situation, you might think, what would a really kind person do? What would a person who really understood conditionality do here? What would the Buddha do in this situation? Or you might know somebody who you think is really ethical, and you think, oh, what would that person do in this situation? And that imagination can help us to really grow. And as well as that, we can imagine the bodhisattva potential in others. So all of us are potential Buddhas. Every living being is a potential Buddha. And we could maybe, a quite interesting thing to do is to spend your day imagining that every single being you meet is the Buddha in some kind of form. They might be acting quite weirdly. You might be thinking that's a strange way for the Buddha to act. But if you treated them as if they were the Buddha, how would your day be? And how would you see those people? And then how would they respond to you? So that's quite an interesting thing to try out. So what we can do is we kind of develop our imagination. A sort of higher level of imagination can develop, which is a spiritual faculty or imaginative faculty, a spiritual faculty. And this can be like a deep intuition of something higher. This can be, and interestingly, in this form of imagination, it sometimes can be as if you imagine something and you feel it comes towards you as well. So it's not just the kind of imagining, I don't know, that you're in Tokyo or something like that. It's maybe when you imagine that you're with the Buddha and you get a sense of something coming towards you. And it's completely mysterious and completely profound. I think, obviously, we all kind of have this false idea that I'm in here and the world is out there, okay? And sometimes we can feel, when we use our imagination, that the world out there is kind of responding to us. And the reason it feels like that is because actually we've got the wrong idea, because there is no in here and out there. It is all just one flow. It's interconnected. So actually we will imagine that there's something out there or in here, but actually that's not true. I'm not sure if I'm making that clear, but it's something about like, it is actually just an interaction between what we see as the outside and what we experience as the inside. It's not, there's no difference between the two. But we have to experience things either as the inside or the outside. So traditionally, quite a lot of Buddhist schools have given us lots of imaginative tools. So they've given us figures, symbols, and myths, which hopefully will enrich our spiritual life, help us to develop imagination. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of those. So, well, we don't know what the Buddha looked like. So there's no photographs of the Buddha, and there's no paintings of the Buddha, and nobody knows what he looks like at all. So in fact, for the first few hundred years after he died, these were the kind of images that were made. So this is the footprints of the Buddha, or perhaps an empty throne. So nobody made statues, nobody drew pictures for a few hundred years. They just had this sense of where the Buddha had walked, or an empty throne with the lack, the emptiness. There was no Buddha there. There was the potential for a Buddha, but he wasn't there. And all the images and statues and pictures that we see of the Buddha, they're simply artists attempting to give like an impression of the enlightened being. They're trying to do what they can with their skills to give us a taste, a hint, a pointing to of the enlightened mind in order to encourage our imagination. They're not actually kind of going, this is what the Buddha actually looked like. You see what I mean? So after a few hundred years, artists did start to create pictures and statues, and obviously they were really strongly conditioned by the particular culture that they came from. So if you were Thai, for instance, there's this way of, as a whole tradition of art, and Thai Buddhas look a certain way. Thai Buddhists probably look a certain way, but Thai Buddhas look a certain way. So I'm just going to show a few images of the Buddha, just to show you some cultural things. And I don't know if you can do that, thank you. So this is a Burmese Buddha. So coming from the Burmese culture, so the particular way that the head dress is. I just chose this one because actually it's quite unusual, because I love the way that he's got his hand like this. I just find that quite emotional. Do we have another one? This is a Chinese Buddha. Another one. This is interesting because this is actually quite old. This is just 200, 300 years AD, if you see what I mean, or whatever. Sorry, that's really old-fashioned. CE. So this is quite old, and this is what is called Gandharavan. Let me just make sure I've got that word right. Yeah, Gandharavan, which was influenced by Greek sculpture. So for some of us who've grown up in the West with Greek and Roman, etc. art, there's a particular aesthetic that we've grown up with. And so I actually really love these because the faces fit more into my history and experience of what statues look like. And there's another one as well, I think. Yeah, that's another one. So there's just something about the simplicity of the line, etc., that just speaks to me. Let's see what else we've got next. Oh, I love this one, actually. This is Chinese. This isn't actually the Buddha. It's actually one of his disciples. But there's something really strong about it. Yeah. And what have we got next? Okay, no, they'll go back to the other one. So I just wanted to show, you've all seen, we've got images all around us here of the Buddha. But it's just really important to realize that the images we see, they are conditioned by the particular cultures they come from. And some of us may relate to them. Some people love full-on Indo-Tibetan bling kind of stuff, that just full-on, all those lots of colours, lots of images, lots of very busy pictures. Some people really don't like them. And because it's different artistic conventions. So it'll just depend on your conditioning. Also, for some of us, modern Buddhist art might seem a bit kind of artificial or stylized, even a bit kind of kitsch. It's just not for some of us, it's not our way. So that's one reason why we might find it hard to relate to these. The others is, I think, that we've got a very profoundly materialistic culture that we live in. And we've lost connection with our own spiritual and mythic past. So I suppose for us, our imagery, for those of us that are from the West, our imagery of the Christian imagery, for instance, maybe pagan imagery before that, we've lost touch with it. And there's a phrase which is like fractured images, which is a sense in which we don't actually connect with these kind of images in a way that people would have a few hundred years ago, or even a couple of hundred years ago. So, for instance, a picture of the Virgin Mary, a kind of Catholic picture of the Virgin Mary, doesn't say much to me, but it would have once said a lot to people who are practicing Catholics, for instance. So, one way that we can perhaps connect to some of these images, is through the spiritual truth and beauty of our own tradition, whatever that is, whatever the tradition you come from. So that might be through music, poetry, art, and architecture. And in the West, those might often be linked to kind of theistic, like in a cathedral. You might go into a cathedral and it feels really beautiful, but it's all about God, and you might not connect with that. But I think there's nothing wrong, in fact, it's great to have those connections, because we're building up that sense of connecting to something bigger than us, our imagination. I can feel walking into a cathedral, particularly if there's music playing, that beautiful music, it really fills me with such positive, beautiful emotion, really gets me in touch with something higher. And I think, basically those people who wrote the music, who designed the cathedrals, they're in connection with the same thing that we can be in connection with as Buddhists, but they called it God. That's all. And I just thought, on to the next picture. So I really love this picture. I went to an Airbnb last week and it had it on the wall. And it's three angels. I don't know what they're doing, really. I don't know much of the story of it, but there's something about the image that I really love. There's kind of like a spiritual friendship between them, a connection between the three of them. And although this is very much a Christian picture, for me, I connect with something else in it. So I think we can all find our own ways in perhaps to the music or the imagery or the architecture of whatever culture we come from. So how does this all work, this kind of images? Why do we connect with them? Well, for many people, there's a psychologist called Jung, you've probably mostly heard of, and he provided a really helpful basis for allowing ourselves to respond to symbol and myth, because he used the word archetype. And that describes meaningful figures and symbols that just crop up in related forms in many different cultures. So, he looked at different cultures that hadn't had connection with each other, and they often had they had similar archetypes. There might have been a magician, a wizard, a compassionate figure, an old man, an old woman, just different figures that were there in lots of different stories, the myths, the images of different cultures. And Jung described them as existing in the collective unconscious of all humanity. And he felt that myth conveys deep spiritual or psychological truths about what it is to be human. And because Jung took quite a scientific approach, his writings can really help us to get our skepticism, that's the word, out of the way, and allow us to open up to a connection with something imaginal. And imaginal, not just pictures, but imaginal in the whole way. And actually, if we see, there's something about, if we are quite rational in a way, if we privilege the rational in our experience, we can have a chat with the rational part of ourselves and go, actually, we're very complicated beings, and there's lots of us to us, and there's part of us which does respond to stories and myths and poetry and music, and it makes complete logical and rational sense to give that part of you beautiful images and positive images to respond to. So that was really helpful for me, actually, when I first started engaging in ritual. It was like I had to keep having chats with that part of me going, actually, it makes complete rational sense, as well as it being, speaking to me irrationally. So, okay. So I'm just going to briefly talk about my own connection with a particular figure. So when most order members are ordained, on ordination, they take up what's called a sadhana practice, which is connecting with a particular archetypal Buddha or Bodhisattva. And not everybody does it. It's not compulsory. It doesn't work for everybody. But for me, a figure that had just been always very present for me ever since I met him was Amitabha. And this is a painting that I had commissioned by Gaurava in our Sangha, a really great painting, a great painter. And so when I do the practice, I imagine the setting sun. I imagine that beautiful feeling at the end of the day when everything goes really calm and quiet. You might just hear a few birds, seabirds, but everything's gone really calm. You're by the sea and the sun is setting. And I imagine, it comes to me, that sense of, in that, it's called the magic hour, that time before sunset when everybody looks really beautiful, that golden pinkish light. So that's the light that's in the air. Everything is really beautiful. And then Amitabha appears. He appears on a red lotus. So I just have a real sense of the purity, the depth of this red lotus, which says something to me. I can't really put it into words, but just this kind of, the depth of the color opens my heart. He's sitting on a moon mat. He's red, and he holds up a lotus. And that lotus, that image of his hand holding up that lotus means lots of things to me. Sometimes it's a gift that he's giving me. Sometimes he's asking me, he's daring me, dare I accept the flower that he's giving to me? So it can mean different things to me. And I have quite a sense when I'm imagining it of movement. So there's the sea is moving a little bit. The waves are moving a little bit. There's that beautiful path on the water of the reflection of Amitabha and of the setting sun. And he sometimes moves his hand to offer that. So obviously these pictures are captured still, and they can sometimes feel a little bit still, not very lively, but we imagine them as being full of light and made of light, completely made of light, and with some movement in there as well. And I recite the mantra, his mantra, and he gives me love. He gives me love that is unconditional, nothing to do on who I am, actually, just unconditional love. And I imagine his love in light pouring through me and filling me up. And I guess like many of us, I've had to work quite hard, or it still comes back for me. I often don't feel good enough. The great thing about Amitabha is he thinks everybody's fantastic. He just loves us. That's what he does. He just loves. And sometimes when I can't love, I can access his love, and that allows me to love other people. So I've been doing the practice for 15 years, so it's a lot more to it than that. But that's a kind of taste of what connecting with my imagination with a figure like this can do for me. And I'm kind of using up a lot of time, so I'm just going to briefly talk about what's going to happen next week, is that we're going to do a ritual together. So doing a ritual together can be a great way to bring our imagination, fire up our imagination. And we're going to do a ritual to Padmasambhava. And I'm going to briefly tell the story of Padmasambhava. You'll hear it again next week, but just in case you haven't heard it, because it's a fantastic mythic story. So basically, Padmasambhava is both a real figure, he really existed as it were, he's a living figure, and he's an archetypal figure. And the story goes that in Tibet, the king there really wanted to introduce Buddhism to Tibet. And so what he thought he'd do is he would build a big monastery for lots of monks and people to come. But the demons who lived in the lake would come out at night and they would take down the monastery. So the people would work really hard building it in the day, and then in the night, out come the Nagas, the demons, and they take it down. And there was a really lovely man a great monk who'd been asked to come to Tibet, and he said, I can't do this. You need to get Padmasambhava, because he's the guy that can deal with this. So Padmasambhava came. I'm really, really making this this story very brief, but basically he spent quite a lot of time traveling around Tibet before he went anywhere near the lake. And what he did is he met the demons of Tibet. He met them all, and in particular, he gave them, he found out their secret, and he asked them to look after a treasure. So he got the demons on his side. Some of them are quite strong, some he just proved himself to be stronger than, very different ways that he worked. And then he came to the lake and he asked the demons to help. So when the demons were on his side, basically the people would build the monastery in the day, and then the demons built it at night. So this story is a myth, which can have a psychological kind of inner interpretation, which is about how we find ourselves often. I think, I'm going to just never snap at anyone ever again. I'm always going to be really kind for the rest of my life. And then something happens and I go, blah, 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 it all comes out. Do you know what I mean? It's like I don't seem to have control over that particular part of this angry part of myself sometimes. And there's something about the only way we can work with some of those energies is with a figure like Padmasambhava. We have to work with those energies of anger, in parts of ourselves that we don't like. We have to work with them, acknowledge them, bring them into the light, see what treasure they hold, and then they can be on our side. So Padmasambhava is a psychological story, a spiritual story. He's also a story about how we might bring Dharma to a new country, because he brought the Dharma to Tibet, and we're trying to bring the Dharma to UK at the moment, and lots of different countries. And I guess you might say there's somehow about we need to think about what the demons of our society and which get in the way of us practicing the Dharma, and how might we bring those on our side. And I'm not going to say any more than that now, actually. Maybe you could talk about that in the groups if you want to. So I've really concentrated on visual imagery, I really feel that, but I just want to say again, there's so many other ways. There's mantra, story, myths, there's ritual, which we're going to do next week. And so I hope that we've seen that there's just the amazing potential that humans have for imagination can actually really help us connect with the qualities of enlightenment, that we can awaken some of the deepest energies within ourselves. And I'm just going to end with a quote from Sangha. Our spiritual life, from this point of view, consists in awakening the imaginal faculty. Once we've begun to awaken the faculty, we will begin to unify all our energies within it, and we will be able to live out our true meaning and purpose. By uniting at higher and higher levels with the images by which the archetypes express themselves, we will be led ultimately to perceive the truth. At this point, imagination becomes identical with prajna, or wisdom.